Welcome back here with Goldberg. Today I wanted to bring your attention to the book Downtown White Police, Demonizing the Alpha Cop, Glorifying Thugs, and Militarizing Law Enforcement by James Lancia. This is a book that a couple of months back it was recommended when I was browsing Amazon, and immediately my cucking sense started tingling, and I said, why hasn't this book been banned? But I didn't give it much thought. A couple of weeks back I bought it on the Kindle program for my e-reader, which I prefer physical books. I guess I just consider them to be, it's harder to get rid of the physical book than the digital, and it's also easier for me to read them. But you save some money with the ebooks. I started reading this thing, and I was like, oh wow, this is really interesting. And you get to the end, and he started talking about some of my family, in the media, and the political establishment, and the policies they push. And I got really triggered, and I said this book definitely needs to be banned. So naturally, I'm going to be talking about it here for your erudition. So James Lancia, he joined the Bridgeport, Connecticut Police Department, I believe in 1978, as an 18-year-old, which is uncommon. Bridgeport, historically, is one of the most violent cities in the United States. And he, being Italian-American, or perceived as white, he volunteered to be a street cop in the Father Panic Village, which is one of the largest and most infamous public housing complexes. So he has a lot of first-hand experience dealing with the type of stuff that's been in the national debate recently. Now, he has nuanced opinions, certainly. One thing that's interesting is that he opposes the growth of a militarized or paramilitary law enforcement system. In fact, he makes the point that you don't really need SWAT most of the time. The street cops were the ones doing most of that, and if you're the right person, you can handle it. He says the reason why you see the push for a federal police force, which the Democrats want, and also just militarization in general, is that police departments have been bringing in people who are not really qualified. I don't know if that's because they don't pay enough money, or it's just, affirmative action of various sorts. Like he says, I think they say 80% of cops, that's one statistic, are overweight, or maybe a small, diminutive woman who can easily be overpowered. Himself, he looks like Rocky Balboa. He says you can't shoot everyone, you can't tase or mace everyone. You have to be physically imposing, you have to have the character to intimidate criminals, which is a pretty good argument, right? I mean, they always say back in the day when people respected cops, well, that's not just because you're going to respect someone in a uniform. You're going to respect them because of how they act and how they behave. So he says if you're not able to physically defend yourself and overpower someone, you're not going to be good at a cop, and it's more probable that you're going to shoot before asking questions. At the same time, he is not very sympathetic to bowel movements matter and these other activists. He's constantly castigating them, leaders of the black community, people in general who misrepresent statistics when it comes to crime, weak liberal whites and others. He makes a really interesting point because you know how I was talking to this conservative cream cheese cuck, and he was saying that, well, do you think George Floyd would have been treated that way if he wasn't black? And I was like, well, I don't know. Are you implying that, every cop who's dealing with a black suspect is a racist, right? And this is one of the things you'll start seeing, this theme of arguing essentially for segregation. That's what you hear from the, bowel movements matter, that a white cop cannot deal with a black suspect. That's ultimately what it's going towards, that you need to have your own police forces. Now, interestingly, this was the initial program. When, black people started becoming cops, the idea was you police black neighborhoods. And then a lot of black police officers started filing discrimination lawsuits saying that it's not fair for us to police black neighborhoods because there's too much crime, it's too dangerous. So he talks about a federal remedy order, which basically limited how much police departments could allow, specifically, this minority matched this particular neighborhood. And of course, obviously, as you had the government mandating more desegregation and forced busing, neighborhoods are going to be mixed regardless, right? That's just the nature of the policy. So it increases the likelihood that you're not going to have cops that just look like you in your particular sphere of the world. And I thought that was really interesting because no one really brings this stuff up. No one makes the connection to the feds. Like, another thing he said is that when these departments take federal money to have new equipment, that also causes them to fall under a lot of federal guidelines. And so the federal government begins setting policies and procedures across the board where they might not be suited to particular communities. One thing he says that a lot of the tactics that police are training in now are actually taken from Israeli Mossad, which his opinion on those people, as I noted earlier, you'll have to read the book to find out, because I was not expecting it. I mean, he's hardcore. He goes after everyone. He goes through a lot of these main stories of racism and explains how they've been misrepresented, or you've had other cases that happen in the same time frame against other racial groups, of course, totally unreported because it doesn't fit the narrative. And yeah, so it's really interesting. He had a great quote, if I can find it, about The View and how they stir up racial unrest. He says, "That nest of cackling sea hags who are every man's nightmare." Yeah, I don't really have any issue with that overall assessment. And you start to get a better sense of how a lot of these cops essentially are powerless, where this debate is going, because they're going to go by a federal guideline. You had a police chief just recently cuck out and apologize for having a flag when he was doing a live stream that had the thin blue line, and the comments on Twitter was like, "That's a white supremacist symbol." I'm like, where are we heading? This is just getting kind of ridiculous and over the top, if you ask me personally. So yeah, I mean, obviously, the way that you prosecute police policy is there's going to be impacts in the community, but if you try to over-restrict, there's going to be problems as well. That's what he talks about. We'll be blamed if we go after someone and we're perceived as being racist, but if then we avoid that situation, we're considered racist because we're not policing. And that's what's going to happen, by the way. These defunding police movements, then they'll turn around and blame systemic racism for the fact that they're not being protected. So he does other things. He defends profiling. He says profiling is really just observation. It's not meant to be used in a malicious manner. If you hamper the police, you end up with more crime. Yeah, not that hard to understand. Okay, this is a point I did want to bring up. He says, even if you look at the stats of like white on black crime, which is not nearly as widespread as the media would have you believe, he said the FBI considers Hispanics to be white in a lot of this reporting, which would totally change pictures, because think about it, gang violence between, Hispanic and black gangs is a pretty big problem. Well, think about what that would do. And I know this to be a fact just in terms of general arrests, because I've known a number of people who, if you looked at them, you'd probably think they're Middle Eastern or Indian. Of course, actually, they came from Central America, because Central America is a very diverse place, very large, especially the Middle Eastern population there. And they, for whatever, they got charged for whatever, and they are listed in the booking as being white. Now, you look at them, you'd say, this person's from Iraq or Punjab or whatever, but they're listed as white. And that's very much the case. Even I've heard it from Persians are also listed as white. So that is an indication of the fact that you can create an entirely different outcome based upon how accurately you're reporting things. So yeah, very fascinating book all around. Absolutely. This guy definitely, as I said, he doesn't have any mercy. He doesn't hold back. He says the things that really need to be said by political leaders, even if it's harsh, even if you don't like it. So some of you, if you read this book, you're just going to be reporting it so it can be banned. Others, you might get a better sense of the situation that we're in. But regardless, I hope you check it out and learn something.